Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti. Welcome to Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò of New York University. We have the pleasure tonight of having yet another conversation on the Forgotten Gems. It's a series conceived by Antonio Monda and run by him, where he invites friends that are normally either writers, directors, actors, and other kind of people. And he asked them, each of them, to come up with 3 films that either has been forgotten or didn't receive proper recognition when they came out, and that somehow deserve a second chance that we are hoping to give during these encounters. As normally we do, we don't publish ahead the titles of the film, so you have a little bit of a surprise when you come here, but in the moment in which you leave the building, they're going to be in our website. So when you go home, you will have all the references to the films that Brian and Antonio have selected for us tonight. I would say that it's not only a little divertissement, even if it's normally very funny, but I would say it's also a way to find an alternative canon of cinema, because most of the films that have been presented to our attention did not really quite make the cut of the history of cinema with all the capital letters in the title. So I think it's a very interesting way to look at a possible alternative to the Storia Ufficiale, to the official history of cinema. So I think that's the purpose of this series that has been very successful. Tonight, Antonio is with Brian Selznick, who is author, illustrator, many books, including The Invention of Hugo Cabret, that, as you might know, is the base for the Oscar-winning film by Martin Scorsese, Hugo. And his newest book, Run Away With Me, is his first young adult novel, but not the last. And it's a great pleasure to welcome him here at Casa Italiana. Antonio, you'll probably know a lot about him because he's here almost more than I am. And he's a writer. He's a professor here at New York University in the School of Film and Television. And his forthcoming book, that is the 10th in a series of 10 books dedicated to New York, his great love affairs after his wife Jackie. And he wrote basically a book for each decade of the 20th century. And the one coming up is about the teens, right, Antonio? And Una mattina gloriosa, a glorious morning, coming in March of the coming year. And without further ado, please welcome Antonio Monda and Brian Selznick.
Thank you. Benvenuti. Welcome back to Le Conversazioni. It's a great honor and pleasure, as usual. And I'm very happy and honored to have with me my friend Brian Selznick.
Hi, Antonio.
We have today, and we didn't know until tonight, 2 Italian films, 2 science fiction films, 1 British and 1 French film. And as you can see, it's quite a rich program. And I will start with Brian first choice.
I just want to say that Jean Vigo directed only 2 films. He died when he was only 29. This is not only a cult film, but is an inspiration for the entire Nouvelle Vague and for many, many other filmmakers, even in Italy, Bernardo Bertolucci. But I want to ask you, why did you pick this film?
I first heard about this film from my husband, David Serlin, when I was beginning to work on my book, The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which starts, and has very much to do and is built around Georges Méliès, the father of film in so many ways, and especially film science fiction, which we're going to get to later. Okay. And I didn't really know anything about French cinema when I was starting to work on Hugo. And so David said, well, you have to see my favorite movie. You have to watch L'Atalante. And I'm a very plot-oriented person. I'm a very mechanical builder of stories. And the first time I saw this movie, it ended, and I was like, what was that? Like, it is as dreamy and strange and complicated as I think that clip alludes to. This is actually a really pivotal moment, in the moment that ultimately was my revelation and my key into the story. Because earlier, in a very passing, funny way, the 2 people who you see, the couple, that's Jean Dasté, who plays a character named Jean, who's the captain of the barge, and his bride is played by Dita Parlo. The character's name is Juliet. And they essentially start the film by getting married, getting onto the barge, and the rest of the movie is just them on and somewhat off the barge as they seem to get to know each other, even though they've gotten married already. And at one point when they're first on the boat, he's washing up and she sort of playfully pushes his head into the water and says, "Did you see my face?" And he doesn't know what she means. She says, "If you put your face in the water, you will see the person of your true love. And I saw you in the water before I met you. And that's how I knew you were the person who I would love." And he puts his head in the water again and he doesn't see her. And he puts it in again and he doesn't see her. And much, much later, this scene happens with no revisiting of the earlier moment. No one ever says, "Remember that scene earlier, remember that conversation earlier." So when I first saw this, because the story meanders in such a complicated, beautiful way, just essentially down the Seine, I had forgotten the connection between those two moments. So at the end, when these two people fall in love in a way that is incredibly profound, I had somehow missed the key. And it was in going back and remembering that moment that suddenly it was like watching, I don't know, like something fall into place in this very, very heavy way. And when that hit me, and probably for most people, they get it the first time round, but this was my sort of, strange experience with it. I wept, and the movie had already ended. I had already seen it, and I think the way that love is depicted, and the complication of love, and the complication of all three of these figures, and there is a fourth young man on the boat as well, but all of them are finding each other in this really, really beautiful way. Francois Truffaut said this is a movie whose feet stink, and he meant that in the best way, where the sense of life and the sense of all of the things that we struggle with are presented here. And everyone has some kind of complicating factor. No one is presented in a straightforward, simple way, the way we actually are. And it also, I think, I would say this is possibly the most erotic film I have ever seen. There is an extraordinary sequence where the two of them have had a fight. They separate. He's asleep on the barge. She's asleep in a little room in Paris after being harassed by men all over the city. And she finally gets into bed. They've had this fight. And we then have this sequence that cuts back and forth between the two of them. My memory was that it was actually a split screen, but rewatching the movie, it's cut between the two scenes. And they're both very clearly dreaming of each other. And they're in their t-shirts, like tank tops and her camisole, and they're sweating, and they're not moaning out loud, but you can see that they're writhing, and they're both in a shadow of a lace that doesn't exist, I think, in either of their spaces. But this shadow, this lacy shadow, somehow connects the two of them, and it's like they're making love to each other across space. And it really is one of the most extraordinary sequences I think I've ever seen.
I want to add only something about the cinematographer, Boris Kaufman. I want to ask my students if you know who Boris Kaufman is. Nobody. Boris Kaufman was the brother of Dziga Vertov, the great Russian cinematographer, who decided to remain in Russia despite of Stalin, while Kaufman decided to leave. He made this film, and then he moved to the United States, where he became one of the great cinematographers. He made On the Waterfront, 12 Angry Men, and a few other films.
Splendor in the Grass.
Splendor in the Grass as well. Let's go now to my first choice, which is one of the first two of the two science fiction films. With the possible exception of Alien, the great Ridley Scott film, the only science fiction films that I like are the ones who deal with ethical problems. And this is one. This is a story written and directed by Andrew Niccol, the filmmaker from New Zealand. You might know him as a screenwriter from a very famous film, The Truman Show, which has several things in common with this film. It's a film about eugenetics. In the near future, by the way, that's Gore Vidal. Maybe you ever recognize him as an actor. And in the near future, he imagined that we would be able to decide at birth who is worth or become a superhero or someone who can fly through the stars and who is not. And of course, there is someone who rebels against it. It's somehow similar to the idea of Blade Runner, or before that, the original short story, Do Android Ships, Dream of Ships.
Dream of Electric Sheep.
Dream Electric Ships. So it's about the rebellion against a destiny, against a fate, which I think is a great theme. The story and the film flopped completely. Niccol was able to make 2 other films. Now he's back in New Zealand trying to have a career there. But he's one of the most interesting voices of the last 20, 25 years. And among his films, together with The Truman Show, where he's only the screenwriter, I recommend another film called Lord of War, about the merchants of weapons in Africa. What I like about this film is, besides the time, there is nothing really of the typical cliche of science fiction. You've seen the locations, you've seen the beautiful art direction by Gordon Baker, but there are no monsters, no explosions, no chase sequence, nothing typical of the science fiction. All is interior. And Niccol demonstrates a very sensitive humanist approach. He likes the hero, Ethan Hawke. Incidentally, that's the film where Ethan Hawke met Uma Thurman. And he likes the anti-hero, Jude Law, who is forced, because he had an accident, not to become one of the selected, how do you say, Aryan race, let's call it the way it is. And you can see it clearly, the eugenetics is very similar to Nazism. Did you know this film?
Yeah, I remember seeing it when it came out and really loving it. And again, my husband is a professor, a historian, and he teaches a lot about the histories of medicine and gender and sexuality and architecture. So this film became like the perfect vehicle for so many of the things that he wanted to teach about all these things, and looking at the way in which disability is shown in this film and used. Jude Law's character, who you mentioned, is in a wheelchair in a brutalist house with a single spiral staircase, which indicates this is a world that is not built for people with disabilities. And the ways in which people look at the flaws in the human body, I think it opens up these really interesting ethical questions that I think a lot of the things that interest you in the film are what first drew David to the film. And so I hadn't seen it since it came out until I rewatched it to get ready for tonight. And I was struck.
You like it?
I loved it. I think it really holds up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think one of the beautiful and interesting things about the filmmaking of it is it looks like, and I mean this I'm going to mean this as a compliment, it doesn't look like it cost anything, because they're using things in very, very creative ways. So you have a glowing light in an otherwise regular-looking kitchen. You have a nice car, except it's making a strange kind of electric sound when it's going by. So it feels like the future is constantly being evoked and not kind of forced upon you. And there's actually a lot of interesting, unexpected connections between this film and Logan and the other movie that we're going to talk about
we'll watch it
later, that we'll watch. And then I also particularly loved the way in which you fall in love so quickly with Ethan Hawke's character, because it's the very simple premise of someone who has a dream. And then you follow through on that dream in the way in which they can or cannot attain that dream, and then that falls into all of the ethical questions that you're talking about.
And it's interesting because the most vital, if not the only living people in this film, are the one with either they're disabled or with a dream. Differently from Gore Vidal, from Alan Arkin, another wonderful sporting actor, even Uma Thurman, I must say.
I think that the script and looking at the humanity of it, and I think every great science fiction film, and maybe this is true of great films in general, has to have a central metaphor for what you're looking at about today. And I think the central metaphor for this, like great science fiction films, holds up really, really well.
And in fact, the next film, which is Brian's second choice, is another interesting ethical science fiction. Let's watch it.
It's amazing.
So tell me why.
So this was one of the most important movies to me when I was 10 years old. I saw it on the TV, and so the premise is that in this society, which is in a domed world, and everyone is told that outside it's poisonous air, and there's been all sorts of terrible wars, and the rest of the world is destroyed, and this is all that's left of society. And when you're born, a crystal, a time crystal is embedded in your palm, and every year the crystal changes color, and when you turn 30, it begins to blink and turns black, and you go to what is called carousel for the ritual of renewal, where you basically are killed. And although everyone buys into this idea that they are being renewed. So it's a society in which everyone is young and beautiful. There's free plastic surgery machines, which make everyone into whatever they want. I think at the very end, I saw two black people. I believe this entire society is a white society. So it's interesting looking at these stories in which the body is a place where there's a battle for perfection, and the way in which race and these kinds of fascist and Nazi ideas follow through. Although the society is presented as a place of great pleasure. There's an early version of like a sex app, except the person shows up right in your house, which actually Woody Allen did as well in Sleeper.
Yes, in Sleeper.
And Logan's job is to hunt down the people who decide not to renew. They run, thinking that there might be someplace else to go to, sanctuary. And Logan is the first runner who begins to question things himself for reasons that are extremely unclear. And then he becomes the first runner who runs. And ultimately, well, I don't know how much I should say about the plot itself.
Please spoil.
But I will say that as a 10-year-old, this idea of this dome society, this place where everybody was perfect, seemed very compelling. And 30 when you're 10 is a lifetime away. So even that, I don't think, seemed that bad, although I had an understanding that you probably shouldn't be killed at 30. Yeah. And the reason this movie remains important to me is because I forgot about it for a really long time until I was in my late 20s and was single and had convinced myself that if I didn't meet someone by the time I turned 30, I would die alone. And I had no connection with this film. Like it was a belief in me that had become very present. And a friend threw me a very big surprise party for my 30th birthday. And my sister-in-law made collages of my life. And it was my birth, my brother's birth, my sister's birth, our bar and bat mitzvahs, my brother's wedding, my sister's wedding, and me and my mom. And I was like, I'm going to die alone. And after my birthday, I was telling this to someone about how sad I was that I wasn't ever going to meet anybody now. And they said, Brian, you can date in your 30s. And it had never crossed my mind. And that's when I realized Logan's Run had gotten into me in a very, very profound way. And it wasn't about death, but it became about love. And I think that the way in which movies affect us as children and even as adults, I think that's ultimately what really interested me, was the ways in which consciously and unconsciously there are certain stories for all different kinds of reasons that connect with us. And it's a wonderfully terrible movie. And there are really interesting ideas in it that if you look at the idea of, a society that is only about youth and pleasure, that does not respect or understand or take any interest in the old people, like aging, about the history, there's no education. And so, thinking about, like the Abby Hoffman and thinking about like don't trust anyone over 30 and what was happening in the society at that time and what was being critiqued. When you see the interior of the dome world, it looks exactly like a mall kind of crossed with what Epcot became, or like, the Disney's version of the future. So I think there's actually a lot of really interesting things in the film thematically that sort of parallel some of the things we were talking about with Gattaca, but and I think we may all have different things from movies that become guides for us consciously or unconsciously as we move through our lives.
And I agree with you, it's a wonderful, terrible film. And let's try to summarize the themes. Eugenetics is for both films, euthanasia, overpopulation, and the difference here, there is this pop psychedelic kind of vision of the world, very tacky but very funny. And Michael Anderson was never a great filmmaker, but he won an Oscar, believe me or not, for a film called Around the World in 80 Days. Which is one of the least successful Oscar winners of all time.
Not a great film.
But this becomes a cult favorite. And it's somehow a film that everybody likes to go back to.
Yeah, I think because of the way in which, for most of the movie, the rules of the film hold together, right? There are great, gigantic, nutso plot holes that you just kind of jump along with because you want to be on his run and you want to be with him in this story. But ultimately where it goes and what happens when they do break out of the dome and into the world, they eventually find themselves in, the air is fine, everything is beautiful outside except there's almost no people. And I think I'm gonna not do every spoiler. I'm gonna let, if any of you do have a desire to watch this crazy film, someone told me to recommend that you watch it with gummies, but it's good on its own as well. But I think that there's a certain kind of bad film where everything within it is taken seriously enough within the world to keep the pleasure constant. And I think the idea of like a great bad film is a very interesting one, and why something remains entertaining and something else is just unwatchable. This is very, very watchable.
Thank you. Let's go now to my second choice, an Italian film. This is a very tragic and little-known story, true story. It's about this young kid who was Mussolini's son, and he was born, I don't remember exactly the year, in 1920. And the mother was Ida dal Ser, who was Mussolini's first wife. And Mussolini refused to recognize both the wife and the son, actually he hospitalized them. And I think it says a lot, if not everything, about Mussolini. What he did in his private life is not less horrifying than what he did to his country. And I also wanted to pay homage to Marco Bellocchio, who now is turning 87 and is still directing. And I think he's one of the great poets of the screen. And I often disagree with his ideas, political ideas, but I absolutely admire him as a human being for his purity and his courage. And even in this film, the way he describes Ida dal Ser, who was not an easy character, let's face it, and the poor kid played when he becomes an adult by the great Italian actor Filippo Timi is quite unique.
Yeah, I had never seen this movie. I had never heard of this film until you put it on the list. And I think so. There are a lot of things I found very, very powerful about the film and very interesting, but I was extremely confused by the beginning because this actor who plays Mussolini and Mussolini's son as an adult is incredibly compelling and sexy. I was very happy to read that he's an out gay actor because Mussolini would have hated that, and it opens with him as a young man at the newspaper. And he has this great. He's having a debate.
He was the editor of L'Avanti, a socialist paper, before becoming Il Duce.
Yeah, he stands up and he says, "I challenge God," and it's extraordinary. But he was so beautiful and so compelling that I thought I was watching a pro-fascist film, and I thought that you would. I assumed you were like anti-fascist, but I've only known you for a decade and a half, so who knows? So it took me a really long time to understand what was happening, and once I was inside the story, and once you are there with Ida and her quest to have herself and her son recognized as who they are and what their relationship is, because they are denied, as you said, and he marries someone else and has 4 other children. Yeah, and there's a madness in her quest, and there's a kind of inability to let go, and there are characters who tell her, like, if you back off a little bit, you could survive. But her need to understand and tell the truth, and to have people understand the truth in a world where truth is no longer of interest to the people in power. What ends up happening is like that moment that you saw where the boy pushes the head off the pedestal. The human story of these two people become the story of what fascism does to a country, what it does to the world, Absolutely. The way in which fascism destroys and fascism controls and ultimately destroys bodies. Like we can keep going back to this idea of these bodies, but as you were saying, like the filmmaking of it is so compelling, that like that image of her floating on that gate there, and there's other extraordinary moments. But I felt like it didn't say fascism is bad. It made you, to understate things slightly, it made you experience it. And I found that very powerful.
It made me think of something that happened in this country, because Mussolini refused to recognize Benito Albino Mussolini and his first wife, Ida dal Ser, because it was an obstacle to his, to him becoming the Duce. And it reminded me of what Joseph Kennedy did. The father of John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy had his daughter lobotomized because she was an obstacle to his dreams of power, which is not less horrifying, let's face it.
Right, so you can
Rosemary was the name, I think.
Right, yeah. So then you can step back from fascism and look at the idea of what power does and what power in general.
Joe Kennedy was a Nazi sympathizer, so we're still in that world.
Yeah, it does lean that way, but ultimately, I was very moved by this and the focus on this relatively unknown story as a way to get at this big, gigantic, powerful idea was really compelling.
So if you have not watched this film, I strongly, strongly recommend it. Now we have your third choice, which is incidentally an Italian film. Well, it's devastating, this sequence.
I just watched this again last night, and this scene made me weep. So this is another story that I found because of a story that I was writing. During the pandemic, my husband, who I should say I met about 4 weeks after I turned 30, won the Rome Prize. And we got to go live in Rome starting in January of 2021 for 9 months. And so I wrote a queer romance about these two boys who fall in love in Rome in 19... Well, actually, I didn't know when it was going to be set. I just knew I wanted it to be pre-cell phone, because I'm generally not interested in writing about cell phones, because I don't think I know how. So everything I write is before then. But I knew I wanted these two boys to fall in love in Rome. And I didn't want it to be a pandemic book, even though it was inspired by everything that I experienced in the pandemic and having the city to ourselves and the empty streets and being in the Sistine Chapel by ourselves with no one else were things I wanted to give to these boys that I was imagining. And the Bernini elephant obelisk in the
Piazza della Minerva.
Minerva near the Pantheon which is a place I love and a sculpture I love, becomes a very important part of the story. So I had this idea that I wanted the boys to meet a real elephant at one point in the story. So I could send them to a zoo, but then I thought Cinecittà must have had elephants at some point in some movie. So I went online and I looked for movies that I thought might have elephants in them. And I started with Fellini because I thought if anyone's going to have a movie with elephants at Cinecittà, it's probably Fellini. And sure enough, I found this film. It was released in 1982, right? I believe?
87.
I think...
87.
Okay, so I thought it was a little earlier because the story... So anyway, what I did was... maybe that is... Yeah, so that must be correct. But I went and I visited Cinecittà. We were able to go there. And I have the boys go essentially onto the set at night when they're filming this movie and find the elephants in a kind of holding area so that they could have their experience. So it was a very technical, and it's funny because I think I set the book in 1982, a little earlier. So I think I got the year wrong, but it's a work of fiction, so it's okay. I like something that has a lot of built-in leeway for mistakes, for historic mistakes. And I watched the film. And it feels a little bit like, I think this was Fellini's penultimate film. And it feels a little bit like the premise of the film is simply that a Japanese film crew is interviewing Fellini about his life and his work. He's
doing a Kafka adaptation.
Yeah, he's doing an adaptation of Kafka in America, I believe.
Yes, America.
And which isn't a film he is actually making. It's all for this film. And so we get to follow him along, and then he's also telling stories about his youth. And those stories are brought to life around him by actors playing characters in his youth, which in a way reminded me of Pedro Almodovar's extraordinary film Pain and Glory, which if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend as well, which is about a director looking back on his life and remembering in a way that is very intrinsic to being a filmmaker. So you get this sense that Fellini is back at Cinecittà dreaming of his whole life. And it's a love letter to Cinecittà, it's a love letter to cinema itself, and it's a love letter to his own stories. The reason that Marcello Mastroianni is dressed as Mandrake the Magician is because in the film, Fellini happens to stumble upon him, and he's filming Mastroianni is filming a commercial. And so he goes, oh, come with me. There's something I want to do. There's something I want to surprise you with. And that's when they just show up at Anita Ekberg's house. And she comes to the door wearing what seems to be nothing but a giant orange blanket and an orange towel in her hair. And she at first doesn't believe it's them through the intercom at the driveway, but then she invites them in and has this extraordinary moment. And this feels like such a gift for all of us, to give us the experience that the young people in that house get to experience, where those young people in the film crew, there's a few young actors, one of the young actors who plays Fellini in his memories of himself is there.
Sergio Rubini.
Yeah, and he's incredibly charming and wonderful. And so like you saw, this is a scene that takes place in what's supposed to be the quote unquote real version of the world, because we do have flashbacks in movies, but in the real world, Mastroianni summons a ghost that turns itself into a movie screen. I just love how when it first appears, you can see the invisible strings that are wired to make it appear, but it summons, and especially this viewing, it really struck me that it looks like a ghost itself, and it's the ghost of his past, of our past, of all the things that we've loved together that cinema creates for us. And so to watch them, and again, to talk about bodies again, to see their bodies transformed and aged, but to be worn so proudly. I love that Anita wears that. She after she comes inside, she changes into whatever that is. I don't know what it's like. I guess it's a dress, but it looks like she wrapped a sheet or something around herself. But she's showing her body, and she is walking through that space. There's a sadness to her, and there's a great, like an emotional weight to her, but seeing her body like that and seeing his body like that and seeing the emotion that they have together, seeing each other now and then actually seeing each other then is something that I feel like you never forget once you see that.
Thank you. Now, my final choice is an English film. I want to confess that it's one of my favorite of all times. In Italy, it had a terrible title. I'd say an Italian title, Gioventù, Amore e Rabbia, which means youth, love and rage. A very bad title. Let's say the English title and the clip. What I love about this film is the protagonist played by the great Tom Courtenay. By the way, the director is Tony Richardson. You might remember Tom Jones. And I think that the free cinema, the English free cinema, is quite underrated compared, for example, to the Nouvelle Vague, which is more or less the same years. What is great about this film is the only way the protagonist can win is by losing. He's a young man who is sent to a juvenile prison, and they discover that he's uniquely talented for long run. So in order to re-educate him, they force him to run for them. And he's winning. But at the last moment, he decided to lose, which is quite moving. It's so strong.
Yeah,
Did you know the film?
No, I had heard of it, but I had never seen it before. And I'd seen a few of the other kitchen sink movies like, A Taste of Honey and things like that, which had a very progressive look at queerness and single motherhood in really interesting ways, but I had never seen this. And I think what really hit me about this film was first of all, the way it uses time, I think, is really interesting because you're cutting back and forth between his time running.
Flashback, flash forward.
Yeah. And then you go and you see his life and you see the robbery that he commits, that he gets caught doing, that you've heard a little bit about when he's in the prison, in the penitentiary. And so there's this slipperiness that's happening between the two time periods. And he's mostly, I don't think it's 100%, but I think most of the time he's remembering is when he's running. Yeah. So you have this sense that as there's a freedom in running, the man played by Michael Redgrave recognizes the talent he has as a runner, like a raw kind of talent. And the only thing Michael Redgrave's character wants, who's running the school, is to beat the boys in this regular school that they're going to compete against. And so by the time I got to that race at the end, there was no question in my mind that boy was going to win, because I had been not only so set up by the film to understand that he had to and that he could easily, but that in terms of storytelling, in terms of understanding what society is, you expect a character to win. And I think when he stops, when he and you realize, like Michael Redgrave's character does, that he's stopping on purpose and he's not going to move, and that's the only way that he can have autonomy. It's the only choice he's actually made you realize it's the only choice he's made the entire film. Everything else he's been forced into. Of course he's making lots of choices about stealing cars and, picking up girls and things like that. But there's a sense of the society that's trapping him in this world that's not offering any other possibilities for someone of his world. And seeing him make that choice, even though it then leads to that very brutal final moment where you see him with, taking apart the gas masks again, which is something he does at the beginning, that running saves him from. Running takes him out of that, and that returns him to it, was very, very moving.
It reminded me that great poem by Rudyard Kipling called If. And he mentions that both victory and defeat are imposters.
So that makes me realize that Jean Vigo also made a film called Zero de Conduite, which was a big influence on Francois Truffaut. There are scenes directly lifted from it in The 400 Blows. And then Lindsay Anderson remade or made a version of Zero de Conduite about overthrowing a boys' school called If. And so
with Malcolm McDowell, the actor from Clockwork Orange.
Yeah. So I think the connection between this and that, I think, is really interesting.
It's time to go. We have a tradition, since we mostly take very depressing film. We have a comic relief. It will be a surprise for Brian as well. A very brief scene. Let's watch it. Isn't it great? It's time to go. I want to thank Stefano Albertini, Chiara Basso, and all the teams. And of course, where is Julian Sachs here at Casa Italiana? I want to tell you that we will be back on February 10th with Ira Sachs. And Colin McCann on February 10th, and then Ira Sachs on the 20th. Here at Casa Italiana, of course. And I want to thank Brian Selznick. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Antonio.